We were talking about food security and the cost of food just before the break. Speaking of that, the Minister of Information, Alhaji Lai Mohammed, had said the rising cost of food being caused by transportation, not made any easier by the cost of fuel. Joining me now on the News at 10 to provide some perspective on this is our in-house data analyst, Babajide Ogusowo. Thank you for joining us on the News at 10. Well, several workers are asking for higher wages because of the rising cost of food. Employers of Labour also saying that their business profit is declining, so pay rise does seem unlikely. But how can all of these be managed, and what's really behind the rising cost of food?
So there's a lot to talk about when we talk about food, but perhaps we should start from somewhere interesting, and that is, what do Nigerians love to eat? And let's quickly look at it this way. I'll allow you to take the first guess. What do Nigerians really love to eat? So what will be your first option?
Rice. Nigerians love rice.
Okay, so you're rice. Yes, and I think we've got some rice and plantain here. So that is the first thing we have as the evidence from the NBS. The NBS also says we do eat a lot of tubers, yam. And finally, what we have, based on the evidence, it's here, a lot of vegetables. So the evidence today shows that between tubers, rice and plantain, and vegetables, it accounts for approximately 47% of all food that we eat. That's approximately 50% of all what we love to eat. But for this instance, let's just take this around and let's focus on rice. And here's why we're focusing on rice, because there are three things that lets you know how important rice is to Nigerians. The evidence shows that we spend more money eating rice than we spend on fuel or electricity.
True.
We spend more money eating rice than we spend even on buying shoes, clothes and bags. The evidence shows we spend more money eating rice than we even spend on transportation. And so when the political season comes, is it a right political strategy for us or for the politicians to give out rice? Yes, it is. However, is it a wise economic strategy? No, it isn't. And here's why it isn't. Because rice is only used for consumption. What politicians need to now focus on is on giving the people things that they can invest in that creates wealth for them. At the moment, it shows that families still spend more than half of all their purchases goes to food. So if you look at the evidence from the South, where 54% of all purchases goes on food, up until the northern region, where we get to the northwest, where families spend 73% of all their purchases on food. It clearly shows and means just one thing, and that is we are gradually eating our future away. Because there's so much demand for food, and families currently spend, now this average of all what we have here is an average of 64%. So 64% of all purchases that families make goes into food. Compare that to the US, where only 13% goes into food. So back home here, food really is the main source of survival for people. And clearly, because of this demand for food, we can clearly see once there's a rise in the price of food items, because that is where all or most monies are going into Nigerians and families, and we really do feel the hit coming onto us.
That's some food for thought there. But what practical steps can be used to reduce the rate at which food prices go up? I know the federal government recently set up a task force to go and find out why food prices are increasing, and then to help to put a cap on prices.
So you talked about practical steps. I probably would say what practical step, and that is for us to even first of all diagnose the problem properly. So today the narrative is that the rising cost of diesel, the bad roads, illegal checkpoints, food storage are the causes of this rising prices. But is this really the cause, or are this mere correlations? So let's look back at what had happened 3 decades ago when the president came in the first time. In 1984, this same problem had come up. And then the private sector had said the rising prices of food was caused by poor distribution. That was the main cause. So why prices skyrocket? February 24, 1984. 6 months down the line, the narrative had changed. If we look at what then happened as the headlines in August 1984, it was no longer a discussion about rising prices based on poor distribution, the president's economic advisors are taking a different point. They had said inflation then was caused by the salaries, that there was huge demands, and then pay rise was frozen across the public sector, and even the plan was to ensure the private sector also curtailed on rising salaries. So we've moved from poor distribution to pay rise. And then what happened immediately after the president left office then? 1985, here's what President Obasanjo then said about rising prices, even though he wasn't president then. So the headline, September 1985, he says the government was to blame for the rising prices of food. He then said the main reason was because the subsidy on agriculture had been removed. Today we are no longer talking about distribution or salaries or subsidy. The narrative has changed again to diesel, to illegal checkpoints. So it really makes us ask that what is really the cause? And clearly there are several things that's causing this. But we also have to be careful that we do not mistake correlation as to cause and effect.
But you really haven't talked about the practical steps.
So for me, the practical steps are clear. We need to identify what are the source of input that drives this cost. And clearly today, the evidence shows, for instance, last year we imported over 3 trillion naira worth of machinery and equipment, and a lot of these equipments do go onto the farms. So here's what it means. It means once equipment prices that go onto the farms, tractors and all that, do go up, then clearly we will likely see prices of food going up. But for families, what is more important is what should families do to be able to manage this rising prices of food. And I think there are 3 strategies families should adopt. The first is families now need to prioritize spending. So we need to move from spending on quantity of food to improving on how they spend on eating right. That's high quality food. Because if we keep spending on, or families keep spending on huge quantity of food, it also implies that there's also going to be a tendency that your health bill and hospital cost will do rise up. So clearly this time around, there has to be priority in spending. The second thing is families also, just like the government is doing, we now need to start creating a very clear budget. And all that budget shouldn't just go into food. So we need to be able to move a lot of our budget from food into something what I call education. So families presently are spending less than 1% of their budgets on implementation. So I said 3 things. The first is prioritizing spending. The second thing is creating a budget. So now that food prices are going up, it is more important to have a budget. The third is, what's the point of a budget if we can't implement a budget? So families also have to move from, after creating their budget, from prioritizing spending to creating a budget and then implementing that budget.
And all of this also is dependent on standard of living, and it's still dependent on income and so on. So many other factors to consider. Thank you so much, Babajide Ogunsowo, for joining us on the News at 10.